The Tag Heuer Skipper is such a cool watch. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's got an innovative design and it wears well. I'm likely no different than most other people. That means that I've pretty much ignored Tag Heuer and their releases for years. In recent years though, something has started to change and I've found myself noticing watches that I would actually consider buyable show up more and more frequently in their lineup. With the release of the Skipper, I found a watch that's worth diving into. Plus, it also gives me the opportunity to talk about how Tag are slowly but surely starting to offer more and more watches that are worth considering from a watch enthusiast perspective. Tag is hated for three reasons. One, everybody loves the original Heuer. They were, I think, by many considered a reputable, heritage, strong watchmaker. In 1985, Tag entered the picture, and for all sorts of reasons, things kind of went a little bit downhill from there. Adding Tag to the Heuer mix over time led to especially enthusiasts losing interest, respect even, for Tag. Second, Tag Heuer has for the longest time had, Hublot-esque kind of marketing. The use of brand ambassadors and just generally the way they approached their marketing was not something that sat well with real watch enthusiasts. At the end of the day though, we could all have ignored the Tag name and the bad marketing if they didn't have a third problem. Their watches were bad, either ugly or crappy or sometimes both. For every well-designed Tag Heuer Monaco, there was also a correspondingly ugly Tag Heuer Formula One Red Bull Racing with a quartz movement. Things are changing though, and LVMH are doing a pretty good job of fixing all their sub-brands in their conglomerate. Tag have basically started to lean more heavily into their heritage and Heuer lineup with models like the Monaco, the Monza, the Octavias, and also the glassbox. The Skipper itself is a 39mm chronograph with a thickness of 13.9mm and a lug-to-lug of 46mm. That puts this watch in the same lug-to-lug category as a Black Bay 54. The movement is an in-house TH20-06 in-house column wheel chrono. It's got a massive 80 hours of power reserve. It beats at 4 Hz, which gives it a very pleasing fluid movement of the seconds hands. It's not the same movement as the one in the original glassbox released earlier this year, as this movement is slightly changed so it can function as a regatta timer. The watch comes with a fabric strap in blue and comes in at just under $7,000. You get 2 noticeable subdials that do the heavy lifting of the regatta timer function and an additional muted subdial for the seconds hand at 6 o'clock. All of this sits under the glassbox, which is fully end-to-end, essentially bezel-less sapphire crystal, which is what made the first glassbox such a talked about watch. And the water resistance is 100 meters. Tag Heuer has developed this movement themselves. It is for all intents and purposes an in-house, which is something watch enthusiasts typically require before we can give a watch our seal of approval. However, you typically lose out on 2 dimensions when getting these fairly new movements. One is thickness. A large part of the glass boxes and Skippers 13.9mm thickness is down to this movement. Thinning down a movement takes time and it's usually not something that you do from the get-go. Just as an example, the Tudor Black Bays. It's only now in the 3rd generation of the 41mm Black Bays that you're starting to get a thinner case, which is partially down to being able to thin down the movement. As for Tudor's chronos in the FXD, well, they've finally gotten to a point where their case is sub 13mm, and even here they're using a movement based on a Breitling movement. The second thing you get, or rather don't get, in this price range is good movement finishing. The display caseback shows off a technically good movement, but it's not finished in any way that can be described more than industrial. It's fine, and if you're a real movement aficionado, you may be able to appreciate the movement from a technical perspective, but for a non-enthusiast, we're not talking about a movement that's a total stunner to behold. The base plate hides most of the fun stuff anyway, and there's not hand-engraved swan neck regulators here and other bells and whistles. For me though, steel caseback and shave off some millimeters would have been preferable. There are lots of different types of chronos, but I would generally put them in 4 broad categories. We have the external tachymeter chronographs. These are the watches like the Rolex Daytona, the Omega Speedmaster, the Zenith Defy, and El Primero. They are almost always on steel bracelets. They are the most sporty and aesthetic of all chronos. They're modern, they're classically masculine, and they are, business casual in their look. Then you have the aficionado chronos. These are chronos that aren't necessarily the best timers from an aesthetic perspective, but they're all about the complexity of the movement, and the finesse of the dials and the movement as well. These are the Langers, the Pateks, but also something like the Longines pulsometer, which was very affordable. There's no sportiness to these chronos, but just leaning heavily into old school and old world charm. Third, you have the tool chronos. These are the pilot chronos and all the other sorts of chronos that have different design conventions. Watches that provide the functionality of a chrono with a focus on a specific tool purpose, flight timing or whatever. You know, the Breitling Navitimer also kind of falls in this category. Finally, you have the retro racers. These are the chronos for people that drive down the coast of the Adriatic in a Morris or a Maserati or a vintage Ferrari. They have no external bezel. The tachymeter, if there is one, is internal. The dials are often colorful. They are always distinctive and classical. Examples of these are the Breitling Top Times and the Chopin Millimilliers, and of course, the glassbox or the Tag Heuer Skipper. These are not as popular as those steel bracelet chronos from the first category, but they have a ton more personality, and I find myself leaning more and more into these types of chronos. The case has a fairly elongated profile to it. This is due to a relatively restrained taper to the lugs that also do not have a curvature to the uppers, rather just sloping out from the case. The lugs are fully polished. The case flanks are laterally brushed. There's not a huge amount of curvature to the case, but it doesn't matter that much as the lug to lug is those diminutive 46 millimeters. The dial sits under the glass box. Now, how do you best describe this crystal? You have this fully domed curvature of the crystal. And if you haven't seen it in person, I think the best way to mentally compare it is to think of a Speedmaster with a Hesalite crystal, but imagine it without the tachymeter bezel on the outside. That's about as close as I can approximate it if you haven't ever seen this kind of design. It makes for what can only be described as an almost huge dial for a 39mm. Underneath the glass, you don't get an empty dial. Many watches with no bezel, like the Nomus Club, can feel very Spartan, but because it's a chrono, there's enough going on to not feel minimalist in any way. The dial itself can be seen in three sections. There's the outer perimeter, which is a matte navy blue. It's got white hour and minute markers. It's got triangles at every hour together with red dots at every hour as well. The inner dial has the same deep navy blue with a radial brushing, which gives it a sunray effect. It's not the most pronounced sunray effect I've ever seen, but rather on the restrained side, which I think is a good thing. Finally, you have the sub-registers with the characteristic colors, two pastel shades of green and orange. The second subdial is unlike the two others, where the two main sub-registers are surrounded by a steel ring. The second dial is only demarcated by the 5-second intervals in orange and white. The hour markers are applied markers, and they are, I think you call them batons. Whether it's intentional or not, I don't know. I just feel the hands look like the profile of a sleek yacht when looking at them from above. What I don't like? Well, there's not much I don't like. For a Tag Heuer, $6,750 is a lot of money. It's a great deal more than a chronograph from Tudor. It's not quite as expensive as a Breitling Top Time, which is a natural competitor in terms of specs and looks. It's also cheaper than an IWC chrono, which is about $7,600. We can get into a long discussion whether a Tag Heuer can command that kind of price, but spec for spec, just under $1,000 cheaper than a comparable IWC is expensive, but not unreasonable to me for a watch that has an in-house movement, a vertical clutch, and 80 hours of power reserve. The wearing experience is excellent except for the height. 13.9 is on the high side, but you don't get a slab-sided Gen 2 Tudor case, and the crystal also contributes quite substantially to the thickness, so it's not too bad overall. Overall though, it's all niggles in the grander scheme of things. As you can probably tell, I really quite like this watch. This watch looks absolutely stunning in itself, but there are a couple of reasons for this. Like I said in the beginning, you've got these 4 basic groups of chronograph types. They all have their defining characteristics and their strengths and weaknesses. This category of chrono, the retro classic chrono's weaknesses, come down to typically 2 things. The implementation of color. It's a bit of a trope, but these watches apparently have to have powerful color combinations. So the Breitling Top Time in red is too much for me. The Top Time in green, also way overboard. The Top Time ice blue, I love it, but I don't think I'd wear it that often. Pretty much all of the Chopin Millimilliers are either way too much or not enough. The closest I've ever been to liking something like this in this vein are the Chronomaster originals from Zenith. I've just never appreciated the overlapping sub-registers, which are so quintessentially Zenith. This tag though is spot on. The navy blue is a deep dark blue that works with a ton of different clothing. It can be dressed up, it can be dressed down, it goes casual, it goes formal, just change the strap. But then it has two sub-registers. The colors they choose, pastels, that don't scream in your face, but rather just give the watch a touch of personality without going overboard. The dial itself is also partitioned into that outer perimeter and inner dial, which together with those two primary sub-registers with the pastel contrasts, creates a really balanced, good-looking dial. The second problem with these types of watches I often have is an over-communication of information. 3 sub-registers, tachymeter scale, and your dial gets really busy really fast. I realized recently that I actually gravitate away from chronos for the very same reason. There's often too much going on, especially in this subgroup of chronos, but not on this one. Because it's a regatta timer, it doesn't need the tachymeter dial, making for a more simple dial. There are only 2 spotlighted sub-registers instead of 3, which again makes for a more balanced, detailed, simple, but not sterile dial. In terms of looks, this thing is excellently executed. I said earlier, Tag Heuer still makes hideous Formula 1 quartz monstrosities. They still have weird collabs like the Mario Kart, and they have overpriced smartwatches. They are, in my opinion, not worth it. The problem with their bad watches is that they are often ugly, don't have the specs, but are priced okay. Yeah, I said they're priced right, and I really think they are. Not for all models, but they are at a price where they manage to sell quite a few Carreras, link bracelet watches and quartz Formula 1s. The price is usually, for many buyers, reasonable. So if you're looking at looks, specs, and price is usually pretty good. Those are the 3 criteria: price, looks, specs. And from an enthusiast perspective, they are at best been hitting 1 out of 3. Recently, though, more and more of their watches are hitting 2 out of 3. Take the Tag Heuer AccuRacer. The AccuRacer Automatic has a good price and a good design. They start at 40 millimeters, you get 200 meters of water resistance with a movement that is a modification of either a Solita or an ETA movement. It's a restrained and infinitely wearable design that price-wise is on par with comparable watches from Oris like the Oris Aquis. The only thing they really need to consider on this model is maybe upping the specs on the movement or getting a slightly higher spec on water resistance. So, 2 out of 3. Then there's the second watch that is worthy of consideration, which is the Autavia GMT. This watch, again, has great design and good specs. It's just overpriced. Comparing this Autavia with something like the Longines Spirit Zulu Time, I would actually go aesthetically for the Autavia. The dial is better executed than the Longines, with no 5-star rating, a better balance of color, and the curved bicolor bezel just looks gorgeous. Overall, this watch bridges vintage better than the Longines. It's got its own very characteristic look. Its downside, it's 50% more expensive than the Longines, and although it's a COSC certified movement, it's still just a reworked Solita comparing with the ETA based COSC movement in the Zulu Time. Paying 50% extra because it's an Autavia is not, in my opinion, justified. But again, 2 out of 3. Which brings me back to the Skipper. Specs, check. Price, check. Design, check. That's 3 out of 3. Tag Heuer still has a long way to go in terms of having a really strong catalog. But as they weed out those 0 out of 3s and the 1 out of 3s and slowly get more 2 out of 3s, they'll eventually get more customers on board, and then hopefully they'll get more Skippers. Because as far as I'm concerned, this Skipper is a 3 out of 3 from me. My suggestion is get yourself a teak deck skiff, make your way down to Lake Como and strap on the Skipper. It and you are going to totally look the part. What do you think about the Skipper and about Tag? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.